Hi, thanks for joining us today. My name is Mary Mahdi, Deputy Editor of The Medicine Maker, and I'll be moderating today's discussion, which will explore how pharma can improve clinical trials. Joining me today are Andrea Valente, Chief Executive Officer at ClinOne, Claire Marsden, who is VP of Digital and Decentralized Solutions at Medable, Dave Hanaman, President and Chief Commercial Officer at Curavit, and Georg Schulz, Executive and Vice President of Clinical Services at Pharma. We're excited to have such an experienced panel of experts with us here today to discuss what we find to be an incredibly important and interesting topic. I'll kickstart the discussion by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves. And with that, Andrea, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Miriam. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. My name is Andrea Valente, Chief Executive Officer at ClinOne. I joined ClinOne approximately 2 months ago, very excited to be a part of this team. Prior to ClinOne, I was with Medable as the Chief Operating Officer, and then prior to that, I was involved with the pandemic response systems that were developed by Oracle in the efforts to help the global COVID-19 crisis. Thank you.
Thanks. And Claire, would you like to go next?
Sorry, great start. Off mute. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Claire Marsden, based in the UK. I am a VP of Digital and DCT Solution Design at Medable. I joined Medable last year, middle of last year. My background is predominantly in operations, clinical research on the operational delivery side, 25 years spanning both CRO and big pharma in all of the delivery plus all the strategic design. So really lovely and to be here and talking to you all.
Okay, and Dave?
Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Hanaman. I'm co-founder and president and chief commercial officer of Curavit Clinical Research. We started Curavit Clinical Research about 2 years ago, just before the pandemic. Prior to that, I co-founded a company called C3I and served as its chief commercial officer also for a number of years. C3I was similarly a tech-enabled services company, similarly in the clinical trial space. We sold that company to a global pharmaceutical company in the mid-teens, and then doubled its size under that organization. And after it was sold off yet again, we decided to get the band back together and start Curavit.
Okay, and finally, Georg. Sorry, Georg, you're on mute.
I'm Georg Schultz. I'm the Executive Vice President of Clinical Services. I work with the Pharma Group, a US headquarter company who delivers its services through a global network of partners and infrastructure. Our mission is to improve lives by increasing the access to medicines around the world. And my support area is specifically to clinical trials, where I've garnered experience having worked and lived for the last 25 years in Asia, providing clinical trial support services, focusing on the logistics and supply chain aspects of the clinical trials and the product availability. Before that, I was in logistics and manufacturing.
Okay, thank you to all of you for those introductions. I'll move into the questions now. Okay, so clinical trials have always had their challenges. Prior to the pandemic, in your view, what were the biggest challenges companies faced in terms of getting trials up and running? I'll ask maybe Claire to start with this one.
Well, that's right in my wheelhouse, so thanks for that question. I think having spent 80%, 90% of my career designing trials or delivery strategies and indeed running those strategies and managing teams to deliver against those, my insight would be it's about accessing the right patient first and foremost. And there are a lot of, if you think about what that actually means, what that translates into, it's understanding where those patients are in terms of the clinic, in terms of their journey through the treatment process and healthcare in general, but also geographically, where do they sit? And then enabling a geographical footprint of that study that supports the access and the ability to enroll those patients effectively. And on top of that, I would also say, obviously, the other side of this is obviously the data element. So it's understanding what are the most critical elements or data points that are required to support that regulatory marketing authorization, and designing that trial to support the delivery or access to that data in the most cost-efficient, time-efficient manner. Shall I hand over?
Yeah, sure. George, perhaps you would like to add to that.
I think my thoughts go in a very similar direction. I think what I would call a crippling pandemic in clinical trials itself, I think, is the constant fight and struggle to stay on time in the timeline. I think most clinical trials, or very often clinical trials, run into problems to not being on schedule, and that is for a variety of reasons. I think it has become increasingly difficult to recruit the patients as a result of a certain saturation in hospital sites, but also entire countries becoming quite saturated. So there's a constant effort required, particularly for CRO supporting patient recruitment to access new markets, new emerging regions with often unknown or incomplete regulations, and the effort that is required to constantly stay on top and ensuring compliance with a dynamic regulatory environment. I think depending on whether a clinical trial sponsor is a big multinational company with good resources on the ground, or whether you are a biotech company that is perhaps just doing the first phase 2 or phase 3 global clinical trial, the challenges can be really enormous in getting just to get the product started, and leave alone to keeping it on track as it goes along several years of investigation.
Okay, and Dave, do you have any thoughts to add to what has been said, or any new ideas that you'd like to put forward?
Well, I agree, especially with the patient recruitment aspect of it. I think that was and remains maybe the fundamental challenge in clinical trials, and I think that the challenge prior to the pandemic was increasingly to find diverse patient populations, not just to do the right thing, but also for the right scientific reasons and for the data and the research. And I think that remains a challenge. I would say that the pandemic, maybe perhaps a silver lining of it, was the rapid adoption of technologies and processes in order to get through the pandemic that now we have as tools in the toolkit, and many of those tools reach those same populations that were a challenge to find prior to the pandemic.
Finally, Andrea.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think Dave makes a very interesting point. The pandemic certainly had a disruptive function to the way clinical trials, and frankly, the entire drug development life cycle has been conducted from research, where you have new partnerships, regulatory bodies having to really change the way they operate and collaborate together, through the actual conduct of clinical trials, where we've certainly seen an acceleration of a decentralized approach to access patients, to deliver medicines to, and that's study drug even, to the way they communicate with their doctors and their sites, and all the way through data, where there's very interesting research going on right now to determine whether this sort of model will allow us to have as high quality data as before, and then determine, gee, if that's the case, then there's an opportunity for us to take advantage of these new methodologies in a much more accelerated way. So, you know, while the pandemic has certainly been very difficult on everyone, from patients to healthcare workers to everybody, it's also had an interesting opportunity presented in terms of clinical research.
Agree.
All right. So we've touched on the way the pandemic has affected clinical trials, but in your view, I'll start with George this time. What do you think the biggest lessons are that will be taken forward? I know that Andrea's covered some of that there, but are there any other things that you believe we'll have to take forward as we look ahead?
Yeah, I think in terms of some of the lessons, I think I would point out probably first and foremost that the realization that decentralized and virtual trials can help to overcome certain constraints that exist on site level, I think is an important realization. I think these type of study designs existed already prior to the pandemic, but certainly became a lot more accelerated as a result of the necessity. This, of course, created new pressure points for the industry in terms of course, compliance of patient data capture and also supply chain, how to make products available to patients. But I think that has been one of the learning points, I suppose. The other point, I think, is that we have seen that it's been often a struggle for individual sponsors, but I think for the industry at large, to process the volume of clinical trials. If I'm not mistaken, by the end of 2020, which was the first year of the pandemic, there were about 2,500 clinical trials registered in the US clinicaltrials.gov portal. And that, of course, for ethics committees and approvers of clinical trials is an immense amount of additional workload that came out of a sudden. And I think companies have tried to find solutions, not only companies, but also regulators, looking at the opportunity of greater collaboration among themselves to streamline different activities with an aim to create, on one side, less workload, but on the other side, to process the task faster.
Okay, Claire, I can see you nodding in agreement. Do you have anything else to add here?
Well, absolutely. What I was just thinking was that, a segue from that is that how the professional bodies and the regulators are now working in much tighter collaboration with the payers and the sites and the researchers as well, in terms of understanding how we can work together to really transform how we do things in terms of our processes, and looking at all of us putting the patient at the forefront of what we do. And what I mean by that is understanding from a regulator and the professional bodies, what are the core endpoints, what are the key fields and functions and data points that are really most relevant to support the treatment of a given patient, and how we work together to not only identify some perhaps more novel endpoints, but also how we can design our trials to be much more efficient in terms of the capture of those endpoints, so that we're removing a lot of the burden from the patients and the sites, removing a lot of the intricacies and the complexity around the trials themselves, focusing on what matters, but really most importantly, providing those endpoints that are meaningful to the patient and the payers and the clinicians, so that patients are more likely to understand the relevance of taking a given treatment and want to actually stay on that treatment, because that endpoint is meaningful to them. So that's where I was I was nodding so frantically.
Okay, and Andrea, any thoughts on this?
I think both George and Claire made great points. The thing I think about often as it relates to this evolution is the patient and keeping them in mind. So there's all of these opportunities, and George mentioned that additional workload associated with the regulatory bodies that are out there, along with the rest of the ecosystem. I think about the patient, and I think about decentralization as not only an opportunity, but also something we need to think about in terms of how they integrate, how they participate in a clinical trial in their life, because data have shown us that retention has actually gone down over the past 5 years. And so it's really up to us to ensure we can help patients and support them in effective ways so that they can participate effectively, not only for their outcome clinically, but also their well-being holistically. And so we do a lot of thinking about that in terms of how we can accommodate not only how they participate from a clinical point of view, but also from a personal point of view. How do we take care of their transportation needs, their dietary needs, other things that need to support them successfully?
Yeah.
Dave, anything else?
You know, I would just, what struck me, I'll bring this maybe full circle. What struck me when George was beginning his comment on this was that necessity is the mother of invention, and the pandemic created this chaos. And then if I sort of wrap it up with Andrea's comments, what struck me there was this notion that many of these things were in place. There was already regulation in place that, you know, was providing some tailwinds to decentralization and adoption of digital processes and technologies. And so these things were in place, but when times are good, it's easy to become complacent and risk averse. And it was that inflection point of a crisis that forced the industry to adopt some bold risks. And those risks in many cases paid off. Again, if nothing else, simply by reestablishing a new baseline for the tools that we now consider to be standard in our bag to address these challenges.
Okay, so we've talked about the pandemic being a stimulus for positive change. I suppose it's helping us push for more collaboration, building efficiency into processes. But what else do you think the industry needs to focus on now to improve clinical trials? And are there any challenges with some of the things you've talked about, for example, decentralization? Maybe Andrea, you can begin this time.
Maybe I just have one last thought
Sure.
on the previous question, perhaps. I think one other learning point that I see in what happened with the entire pandemic is perhaps the need for greater emphasis in risk management and risk assessment in the planning of a clinical trial. Perhaps there's not enough consideration given to risk management in the past. And here I'm referring to, for example, topics like not only the sudden surge in transportation demand for certain controlled temperatures, but also the general shortage of medical supplies and availability of comparator drugs or concomitant medicine, or even simple saline vials that became all of a sudden in shortage. This in part, as government reclassified on one side and enlarged the pool of what they consider critical medicines to be kept on stock in a country and creating export prohibitions, or all of a sudden certain antiviral drugs became candidates for COVID-19 treatment and were used in a different volume of anticipation. So I think supply chain and risk and the consideration around that, because ultimately, if a clinical trial is not supported by an adequate and risk-free supply chain, I think we all have seen how quickly it can cause disruptions to feeding patients and sites with the materials that they need to support the trial.
Yeah.
And I think the industry maybe has become a bit more aware of that, and maybe that dovetails into the next question of what the industry should be doing going forward.
Mm.
Right.
So just to add to that and maybe transition to the next piece, I think that there's certainly the opportunity to flex additionally, given now there may be some more confidence in the way decentralization can be utilized. I think to Dave's point, it certainly was there, utilized prior to the pandemic, now certainly many more proof points where a comfort level has now risen. I think about eligibility for participants as an opportunity. That's a learning that being able to extend and expand eligibility of participants to participate in a clinical trial is something that was explored during the pandemic and needs to continue to be so. I think about the opportunity around just flexibility overall how can studies be designed, to Claire's point, to be more of a master protocol, more of a simplified approach to design, so that the outcomes certainly are continued to be collected, but are much less burdensome on the entire system, whether it be the site or the patient in particular. So those, I think, are learnings and opportunities that we can take forward as we move past the pandemic.
The other point that I would make, and I think is really, it was there before the pandemic, but I think it became more, I think people became more aware of it, not just in our sector, but across the globe, across the industry. And that is ensuring that we enable trials to be inclusive, that equitable healthcare was really put under the spotlight as part of COVID. I think we can all speak to some stories and some headlines that kind of resonate around that point. And I think what is really important is that we take and we respond to that in a positive manner, in that we design and execute studies that are designed to ensure that we address those previous imbalances, ensure that that studies are inclusive, that we do respond to the representation or underrepresentation issues that have come up in the past, but also provide that access point. So it's not just recognizing that this needs to happen, but also providing a process and a tool and a system through which enables the response to that problem to be addressed. So I think that's another thing that I really feel has come, is a big learning that's come out of this, but a positive learning, an opportunity for us.
And then Dave, any thoughts on that as well?
Well, yeah. So coming out of it, maybe I'll argue the downside of the upside. If the upside is these new digital technologies and processes, and we're all excited about it, and we've all decided now that these are fully acceptable practices and the industry's adopting them. The caution that I would throw out, or maybe a lesson learned that we might avoid from the beginning, is the classic response of trying to over apply these things just because they're cool.
Yeah.
And so, I think that maybe a critique of the industry that I would offer is that in many cases, despite despite excellent intentions, people are creating the worst of both worlds. They're taking traditional heavy footprints and then they're shoehorning technology back into them so that they can show the world that they're doing a decentralized or a hybrid trial. And I think that in many cases, it's the patient that suffers. So, we talk about patient burden going into sites and all the other things that are typical of traditional trials. Sometimes we don't get rid of those things, but we now suddenly say, here's a new application that you get to download and use every day. And those applications may not work as well as we would like them to, or we don't provide the training. And so it's a really simple example of we've actually increased patient burden because we've not really taken away some of the old burden, but we've added these new technology layers. And of course, that can be frustrating, especially if you start talking about populations that may not be as comfortable with technology, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my caution would be let's not in our enthusiasm and well-intentioned desire to adopt technology create a worst of both worlds scenario. Let's design these things from digital first principles in a way that we are streamlining the trial and streamlining the patient experience.
Yeah.
So just a follow up to that, Dave, because I think it's actually important and sort of thought-provoking to me. I almost don't think digital first. I almost think flexibility first, because there's an opportunity because not only the patients are also encountering these new technologies and having, again, as I mentioned, to sort of integrate them into their lives as they're participating in a clinical trial. The site does also, and the site is also experiencing that level of, technology burst, I'd call it. And so I think we need to do a better job to figure out how we can coexist effectively, how we can integrate and interoperate effectively so that it can be, embedded so sites can work effectively and patients can adopt effectively. So to me, I think about human first as we move forward past this chapter.
I think there's an interesting dimension here because when using technology or the emergence of the virtual trial design, I think resulted of a need of two groups. It's on one side the needs of patients not having to go to hospital because it's being deemed a high risk environment to go to hospital for, let's say, clinical trials that involve healthy subjects. But on the other side, there is the hospital side and their needs. And in that case, it's the question, how can we protect the healthcare workers from exposure to patients who have an infection that could possibly pass on to them? And we consider them obviously vital to the whole infrastructure. So digitalization and the decentralized trials have kind of created a safe pathway where requirements of both groups could be met and conditions improved, and I wouldn't be surprised if that would mature, or technology would mature over time to not only be used in clinical trials, but that this will become a regular part of the healthcare system. Topics like telemedicine and wearables, that maybe for certain consultations. Indeed, we can do this just as good by way of technology.
One thing I would say, and I think to David's point, is that I think it's understanding where digital and home health solutions are most effective and most valuable to all parties. And it isn't, as David rightly said, it isn't about just using it for using its sake. And so I always look at it as using it in a fashion that is going to remove barriers or lift burden or alleviate stress on patients and or sites, rather than just it's a really, it's a nice tool that we should, we want to kind of slot into existing design of a study. And I must admit, in my time at Medable and previously I was with a very large CRO and working with many clients around understanding what DCT is. And it's very true. A lot of people default to the setting of is from going from wholly brick and mortar to fully everything virtual. And there is no way you can deliver something like that in most cases. Most studies are much more complex. And yes, you're absolutely right that by doing so, you're actually creating more complexity and more barriers for both patient sites and sponsors to achieve their goals. So I think this debate is fabulous because it really does get to the heart of what we're all living and breathing every day in terms of trying to find that that target, that kind of point at which it meets the needs. It's a fit for purpose design using the new tools that we have, and it helps us to remove some of the barriers that we have all been living with for many years in a much more conservative environment that clinical trials tends to be in.
Okay, so let's
and I think the last thought from my side, I think, is to introduce again the earlier notion on risk management and mitigation planning. I think part of a good clinical trial planning really involves also mapping out the risk scenarios, and these really, I think, as we have seen by recent events, on a number of different dimensions, not just pandemic scenarios, but also in general supply chain risks and geopolitical evolution and monitoring, and say, okay, what are hotspots around the world, and if something was to happen, do we have a plan B to substitute populations or regions of possible conflict or of elevated risk because in the end, we're still trying to achieve a critical timeline. And if something happens, how do we get out of that? Do we have already a plan in the drawer that only requires fine tuning, or do we then only in the moment of crisis start to actually conceptualize a plan? And I think that perhaps the industry can maybe learn something from other industries, but this is perhaps already quite common and normal.
I do think the supply chain issue is much bigger than a lot of people give credit. And I, as I say, coming from a CRO that living through the pandemic, I saw that firsthand in terms of all of the aspects that the pandemic hit in terms of getting lab kits out the door, or even, built, getting them out the door, and then the treatment, kind of to the right sites in the right time frame.
Yeah, I'm mentioning this topic because as Tanner Pharma, we and being supply chain experts supporting clinical trials, we have really seen a whole number of new risks or shortages of all kinds of products that affect the supply chain in very different ways. We had seen scenarios where simple products like labels for packaging of clinical trial supplies have become in shortage because the paper material didn't come out on time out of China, or that there was a shortage of the manufacturer producing validated reusable shipper boxes for temperature control because the vaccines have taken up so much of the volume. And all of a sudden, projects come to a grinding halt because products are not available that are essential to move the product. And without product, there won't be a continuation of the trial, even if you do everything else right.
Yeah.
So I think it's really, an important component as every other one.
Okay, I think some of your points lead well into the next question, which is about Ukraine. The European Medicine Agency recently released some advice to sponsors on managing the impact of the war on Ukraine. How do you think the war will disrupt or has disrupted clinical trials? And what advice would you give to companies affected by this situation? I think we'll start with Dave this time.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to start by maybe reinforcing the point that the panel has been making about the challenges and the decentralization. My take on the war in Ukraine is that it is just another reminder that there is no real normal, standard, benign world out there. So going into this, people talked about, and we faced questions in our company about the pandemic, saying, well, decentralized trials are great, but after the pandemic, aren't they going to go away? And of course, we said no. And we pointed to the chance of other waves. And of course, now we're in our third or fourth or fifth, depending on how you want to count it. And then people thought, well, after the pandemic and all those waves, then these processes will go back to normal. But now we have a very disruptive war in Ukraine, and we're talking about similar, if not, much more significant geopolitical challenges in the Pacific, and vis-a-vis a rising China and a rearrangement of the geopolitical order in the Pacific. So I think that Ukraine is just another reminder that there is no normal, and that these tools are going to be used going forward for all of the types of disruptions that we can predict, as well as those that we can't.
Andrea, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on Dave's comment and thinking about the geopolitical landscape, and it really creating what is defined as a new normal. And I think Dave's point is very well taken. I think that we will have to continue to flex our adaptive muscles to live with what's going to be change, regardless of the situation. And while certainly the pandemic was one iteration of that. There will be others that we don't even know. And so we will have to ensure that we have sort of those mindsets of adaptivity and flexibility in order for us to sustain our ability to evolve and innovate, because this is all creating an opportunity for us to innovate in different ways. And so therefore, I think we're going to discover ways of delivering clinical trials that we don't know exist today. And this will be based on what we see in the future. So I know that's sort of this crystal ball view, but I think the point is, to Dave's credit, change is going to be in place and disruptivity will be in place regardless.
I think my thought is that I bring it back down to, why did we do clinical research in the first place? And it's all the basis of getting, effective treatments to patients, and to enable that process to move faster, more efficiently, more cost effectively. And I think one thing that we all have to do in this area is understand that what's most important is the patient, is that continuity of treatment, that ability to ensure that the patient's needs and care is first of front of mind in everything we do, whether it's in the healthcare sector as in terms of marketed product, or whether it's actually in the clinical research side, because the clinical research feeds healthcare in terms of the new treatments that are coming through. And so whether I remember in the midst of the pandemic watching a patient on the television who had lung cancer, and their story was a painful story around this was their last hope. This trial was their last hope of potential treatment, survival for a little bit longer, being with their families, etc. And all of a sudden they were obviously disconnected from their families, but also the trial was stopped because of the pandemic. And so whilst we are thinking around, okay, this is, as David said, very exciting, it's innovative, and and we're all, creative juices are flowing in terms of what else can we do, and it's very disruptive. I think ultimately it's about really putting yourself in the patient's shoes, understanding the needs of the healthcare system, and understanding that what we can do, or what we can build in terms of processes, to really support the continuity of that treatment. And to that end, I think that risk assessment at the beginning of trial designs, it is so key now, because we all have to really reflect on, as David said, there is no norm that we can all depend on. So we have to design our trials and understand potential risks, but look at how we can flex around what can happen, understanding what that can or could look like. Sorry.
Yeah, I think looking at it from a practical aspect, in terms of the question about the continuation, or how to continue with the ongoing trials in the Ukraine, I think there is perhaps two points I like to bring up here. I think the first question is, a sponsor needs to perhaps evaluate if a trial can still continue to go ahead until the end, if there is a risk of a potential gender biasness. What I mean by that is that what is the likelihood that the male population in Ukraine will be able to enroll new patients or complete the trials if they are on the trial, and conversely, we are seeing particularly women and children having the possibility or the opportunity to leave the country. And how do we ensure that the industry creates opportunities for those patients, for ethical reasons, that have to leave the country, that they can somehow continue the trial outside of the country? And again, we are talking primarily about women, because male in a certain profile are not allowed to leave the country. So there is already a certain biasness. So I think the pharmaceutical industry can look into how to develop strategies with specific partner sites in the surrounding countries to see how patients can be brought into these countries to offer them a site in which the treatment can continue. And that is, of course, full of challenges, starting with language challenges, translation challenges, but also how do you rescue data and documents from sites in the Ukraine that have become dysfunctional, where a patient has done half the trial in the Ukraine, now wants to continue in a site in Poland. How do we retain the data and documentation? But I think I've heard of trials that are being ported over into other markets. And I think that's an interesting approach that individual companies can really look into when looking at this crisis region.
I wonder, and I certainly don't know the answer, I wonder if this also has a dimension of disruption in Russia also, given the relationships that have changed now over the course of the past several months, and opportunities for participants in Russia associated with clinical trials. Clearly, there's physical disruption in the Ukraine. And George, I think you bring up some really interesting points around the population changes, and then the opportunities for participants to re-engage in some way based upon a different physical location and so forth. I wonder, given the relationships and the changes of those relationships in the Pacific as well as in Russia, how that also impacts the dynamic of clinical trial access, and what that means.
And then just finally, are there any closing points that any of you would like to make? I suppose I'll start with George this time and then work my way around.
No, I think I would just perhaps summarize this by saying that the crisis in some way, or the pandemic in some way, has really helped the industry to get to a different level of efficiency, of innovation. And I think to Dave's point, not everything necessarily is good or to be used in all circumstances, but I think the toolbox has been enriched. And it's really down to making smart choices of which tools work in what circumstance best. And those solutions that in theory we thought were good solutions, but in practice didn't work out so well, I think they're worthwhile relooking and see whether they should be improved or dropped. So I think, but the industry is definitely in a better place. And I think that's good for patients, that's good for healthcare in the long run.
And then Dave, do you have anything to say at the end of this discussion?
Well, as I think we all are, I'm really excited about the adoption of these digital technologies and processes. And I do see it as a silver lining of the pandemic, and I do see it as here to stay. And I agree with our enthusiasm for our own little piece of this industry. And I would just add to that I'm at least as enthusiastic about the adoption of these digital technologies and processes in the therapeutic and diagnostic categories themselves. So we're all doing our best to help bring these things through the regulatory and research and process and bring these things to patients. But it's our sponsor clients. I think all of us on the phone, it's our sponsor clients that are doing the heavy lifting of applying these same technologies to therapeutics and diagnostics themselves. And much like this industry that we're talking about, our little piece of it, digital therapeutics and digital diagnostics are there are pure plays, and then there are hybrid plays, and the benefit, I think, to patients we are only just beginning to recognize. And we're very happy to be playing a small part in helping bring those digital therapies and diagnostics to market.
Okay. And then Claire.
Well, I think I'll just echo what's been said before me. I think it's a really exciting time. I do think we were en route to this change and this transformation before the pandemic, and obviously the sad war in Ukraine. I do think the industry was ripe for disruption, prior to that point, and there was an acknowledgement that we need to change our practices to really help advance how we do things, in how we conduct clinical research, and also how we look at better servicing our patients in terms of the healthcare provision, as I say, being much more equitable, much more inclusive, and helping our patients really get the treatments they need in a way that suits them. So I'm thrilled to be part of this journey, and I do think it's about understanding or recognizing there needs to be a smart approach in terms of how we deploy and execute trials in this setting. And I think it's only by doing it that way that we will reap the most reward.
And then last but not least, Andrea, please.
Thank you. I'd just like to commend and echo my colleagues on the panel here. They've all made incredibly important points. And I think thematically, we all agree that digital technologies in this space really do provide potential for us to bring therapies to patients faster, for us to be able to, and that's across, as Dave said, the sponsors. What we're doing is our little piece, but even more broadly, and ultimately serve patients in the best way we can, given the circumstances. So I'm very excited about it. I've been a part of this industry for 20 plus years and continue to come back to it and love it. And I think we're all here for that very reason, to help society and help better patient life.
Okay, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking part in such a fascinating discussion on clinical trials. It's been a pleasure to hear what you've had to say about this topic. I'll take the opportunity to close the discussion now, but for our audience, if you would like to reach out and share your views on this topic, please feel free to do so. You can contact us at our website, on our website. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks to our panelists again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.